The sky above Sylvathir burned with colors that no elf had ever seen before, and Alara Moonwhisper stood atop the grand beacon tower, watching her world die beneath waves of alien ships that looked like living creatures made of twisted metal and pulsing flesh. The Crithian swarm had arrived 3 days ago, and already half the planet was consumed by their hunger. Alara could see the ancient forests burning in the distance where her people had lived for 10,000 years, and now those trees were nothing but ash and smoke, rising into a sky that grew darker with each passing hour. Beside her stood Shadowfire, and the great dragon was as black as the space between stars, with scales that seemed to hold tiny points of light like a night sky brought down to earth. The dragon was massive, and his wings when spread could cover the entire tower platform, and his eyes glowed with an intelligence that made most beings uncomfortable when they met his gaze. Alara reached out and placed her hand on Shadowfire's neck, and she could feel his heart beating strong and steady, even as their world fell apart around them. She was different from other elves, and she knew this even though she had spent centuries trying to hide it. Her skin bore markings that glowed with soft blue light, and these markings ran down her arms and across her shoulders in patterns that looked like writing in a language no one could read. When danger came close, the markings would burn brighter, and right now they were shining like small stars against her pale skin. Below in the council chambers, the elders were gathered around the ancient galactic distress beacon, and Alara could hear their chanting even from this height as they activated the device for the first time in recorded history. The beacon was old, and it had been built by hands that were not elven, and it was a gift from the Confederacy of Stars, who had promised to protect Sylvathir if ever danger came. The elves had never needed to use it before because they had always been strong enough to defend themselves, but the Crithian swarm was different from any enemy they had faced. These creatures did not want land or resources, and they did not come to conquer. They came only to consume, and they ate everything in their path, from the smallest blade of grass to the mightiest tree, to the very stone of the planet itself. Alara watched as another wave of Crithian bioships descended toward the eastern continent, and she saw the defensive shields flare and die as the creatures overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. Her people were dying, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Shadowfire growled deep in his chest, and the sound was like thunder rolling across mountains. The dragon could sense her despair, and he pressed his great head against her shoulder, trying to offer what comfort he could. They had been bonded since Alara was young, and in all those centuries, Shadowfire had never left her side, even when other dragons had abandoned the elves to seek their own paths among the stars. The beacon suddenly flared to life, and a pulse of golden light shot up from the tower and pierced through the smoke and darkness to reach into space beyond. Alara felt the pulse pass through her, and her markings responded by burning even brighter than before. The message was sent, and now they could only wait and hope that someone would answer. The elves expected the Arxians to come first because they were the peacekeepers of the Confederacy and they had the fastest ships. Or perhaps the Talvoth warrior clans would arrive because they loved battle and would not turn away from a good fight. But hours passed and no ships came. The Crithian swarm pressed closer, and the outer defenses began to fail one by one. Alara could see elven warriors fighting in the streets below, and they wielded weapons of light and magic that had been forged in the heart of stars. But even these mighty weapons could not hold back the endless tide. Shadowfire suddenly raised his head and his eyes went wide. Something was coming. Alara felt it too, and her markings began to pulse in a rhythm she had never experienced before. The space above Sylvathir rippled like water disturbed by stones, and then ships began to appear. But these were not the elegant vessels of the Arxians with their flowing curves and crystalline hulls. These were not the living ships of the Talvoth that grew from sacred seeds and sang as they flew. These ships were brutal and angular, and they looked like they had been built from scrap metal and welded together by hands that cared nothing for beauty. They were covered in armor plating that was scarred and dented from countless battles, and they bristled with weapons that looked primitive and crude. There were dozens of them, and they moved in tight formations that spoke of discipline and training. Alara had never seen ships like these before. The elven defenders below were silent as they watched this strange fleet take up positions between Sylvathir and the Crithian swarm. Then the communications systems crackled to life, and a voice spoke in a language that the elven computers struggled to translate. The database searched through millions of records, and finally found a single reference buried deep in the restricted archives. Human. The voice belonged to a human, and the database said that humans were a young species from a small world. called Earth, that the Confederacy had marked as too dangerous to contact. They were listed as aggressive and unpredictable and prone to violence. The Confederacy had placed their entire star system under quarantine and forbidden any species from making contact until the humans had matured for at least another 1,000 years. But here they were, and their ships hung in space above Sylvathir like metal guardians. The translation came through, garbled at first but then cleared. The voice was female and she spoke with confidence that seemed to fill the air. She said her name was Commander Katie Morrison of the Earth Defense Fleet, and she said that humanity had heard the distress call. She told the elves to hold their ground and defend their people because help had arrived. Elara felt something strange happen inside her chest, and her markings blazed so bright that Shadowfire turned to look at her with concern. The dragon could feel through their bond that something fundamental had just changed. The human fleet did not wait for permission or approval. They simply opened fire. But their weapons were unlike anything the elves had ever seen. There were no beams of pure energy or missiles that phased through shields. Instead, the humans fired solid metal slugs that moved so fast they punched through Crithian bioships like arrows through paper. The sound of the impacts echoed across space, and Elara could hear it even through the atmosphere. Explosions bloomed across the Crithian formation as human missiles struck home, and these missiles carried warheads that released energy signatures. The elven scanners identified as primitive nuclear fission. The elves had not used such crude weapons in millennia, but they could not argue with the results. Crithian ships were dying by the dozens. The swarm tried to adapt and they sent swarms of smaller craft to overwhelm the human ships with numbers. But the humans were ready, and their point defense systems came alive with tracers of light as automated guns fired thousands of rounds per second. The smaller Crithian craft were shredded before they could get close. Elara watched in amazement as the human fleet fought with a brutality and efficiency that seemed impossible for such a young race. They did not dance through space like elven pilots. They did not rely on shields and energy manipulation like the Arxians. They simply flew straight at the enemy and hit them with everything they had. It was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Shadowfire roared, and the sound carried across the entire city. The dragon launched himself from the tower, and his wings caught the air as he spiraled upward toward the battle. Elara felt his excitement through their bond, and she knew he wanted to join the fight. She held onto his neck as they climbed, and below she could see the elven people emerging from their shelters to watch the impossible sight of unknown aliens saving their world. The human ships were taking damage now as the Crithian swarm concentrated their fire, but instead of retreating, the humans pressed forward. One human ship took a direct hit that tore through its hull, and Elara expected it to fall back, but instead it accelerated directly into a Crithian bioship, and the resulting explosion took out 3 more enemy vessels. These humans fought like they had nothing to lose, or like they believed that some things were worth dying for. Shadowfire reached the upper atmosphere, and Elara could see the battle more clearly now. The human ships moved in coordinated groups, and they covered each other with overlapping fields of fire. When one ship was damaged, another would move to shield it while it retreated. They fought as a unit, and they fought with purpose. The Crithian swarm began to pull back, and their bioships retreated toward the outer system. The human fleet did not pursue, and instead they formed a defensive wall around Sylvathir. Elara guided Shadowfire back down to the tower, and as they landed she saw that every elf in the city was staring up at the sky. The elders emerged from the council chambers, and their faces showed confusion and wonder. One of the elder council members looked at Elara and asked who these strangers were and why they had come. Elara looked down at her markings, and they were still glowing brighter than they ever had before. She did not know the answer, but she knew that something important had just begun. The human fleet hung in space above them, and Elara wondered what kind of people would cross the stars to save a world they had never seen. She wondered what it meant that her markings had responded to their presence. And most of all, she wondered why the humans had arrived when the rest of the galaxy had stayed silent. The battle in space had ended, but the war on the ground was far from over. Crithian ground forces had already landed on Sylvathir before the human fleet arrived, and now these creatures were spreading through the forests and cities like a plague. Elara stood on the eastern wall of the capital city and watched as groups of Crithian soldiers moved through the burning trees. These ground troops were different from the bioships, and they walked on 4 legs, with bodies covered in chitinous armor that seemed to shift and change color to match their surroundings. They carried weapons that grew from their own bodies and fired bolts of Hades, acidic poison that could melt through stone. The elven defenders were holding the walls but barely, and Alara could see that they were exhausted from days of constant fighting. Shadowfire crouched beside her, and his eyes tracked the enemy movements with the focus of a predator. Then something screamed through the sky above them, and Alara looked up to see a human ship falling. The vessel was small compared to the warships in orbit, and it was trailing smoke and fire as it plummeted toward the forest beyond the city walls. The ship crashed with a sound like thunder, and trees exploded outward from the impact site. Alara did not hesitate, and she vaulted onto Shadowfire's back, and the dragon leaped from the wall and spread his wings. They flew toward the crash site, and Alara could see that the human ship had carved a deep trench through the forest floor. The hull was cracked open and flames licked at the metal. But even before they landed, Alara could hear the sound of gunfire coming from inside the wreckage. She slid from Shadowfire's back and approached the crashed ship carefully with her hand on the weapon at her side. Through the smoke she could see movement, and then figures emerged from the wreck. They were humans, and they wore armor that looked heavy and practical rather than elegant. There were 5 of them, and they moved with weapons raised and their heads turned constantly to scan for threats. The lead human was female, and she was shorter than Alara, but she carried herself with absolute confidence. Her armor had markings on the shoulder that Alara could not read, and her face was streaked with dirt and blood. When the human saw Alara and Shadowfire, she raised one hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture, but her weapon stayed pointed at the ground, ready to lift at any moment. Alara was about to speak when she heard the clicking sound that meant Crithian soldiers were close. The humans heard it too, and they immediately formed a defensive circle with their weapons facing outward. Then the Crithian swarm poured out of the forest, and there were dozens of them. The humans opened fire without hesitation, and the sound was deafening. Their weapons spat fire and metal in continuous streams, and the Crithian soldiers fell in waves. But more kept coming, and the humans had to keep firing until the air was thick with smoke. Alara drew her own weapon, and it blazed to life with blue energy, and she joined the fight, cutting down Crithian soldiers that got too close. Shadowfire roared and bathed entire groups of enemies in black fire that burned cold instead of hot, and froze the creatures where they stood. The lead human woman fought with controlled precision, and she called out orders to her squad in that strange language. They moved like they had trained together for years, and they covered each other perfectly. When one human needed to reload, another would step forward to fill the gap. Alara had fought alongside elven warriors for centuries, but she had never. I've seen this level of coordination from such a small group. A Crithian soldier broke through the line and rushed at the human woman from behind, but Shadowfire was faster. The dragon swept his tail around and knocked the creature away before it could strike. The human woman glanced back and saw what had happened, and she nodded once at Shadowfire in acknowledgement. The dragon seemed pleased by this. The Crithian attack finally broke, and the surviving creatures retreated back into the forest. The humans immediately began checking their weapons and counting their ammunition. The lead woman approached Alara and removed her helmet. She had short dark hair and brown eyes, and her face was young but carried the hardness of someone who had seen too much combat. She spoke, and again the translator struggled before providing a rough conversion. The woman said her name was Lieutenant Amy Brooks, and she thanked Alara for the assistance. Alara replied that she should be thanking the humans for coming to help her world. Amy smiled at this, and it was a tired smile but genuine. She said that humanity had a saying about leaving no one behind. Alara asked why the humans had come when the rest of the galaxy had abandoned Sylvathir. Amy was quiet for a moment, and then she said that her commander had made it simple. The commander had asked whether it was right to let innocent people die when humanity had the power to help. The answer had been no, and so they came. It was such a straightforward answer that Alara found herself surprised. The elves would have debated for days about political ramifications and ancient treaties, and the balance of galactic power. But the humans had simply decided it was the right thing to do, and they acted. Shadowfire moved closer to Amy, and the dragon lowered his great head to look at her directly. Amy stood her ground even though the dragon was large enough to swallow her whole. Shadowfire sniffed at her, and then made a rumbling sound that Alara recognized as approval. The dragon had never warmed to strangers this quickly before. Alara's markings began to glow again, and she felt warmth spreading through her chest. Amy noticed the light, and she asked what the markings were. Alara said she did not know, and this was true. She had been born with them, and they had always been part of her, but no elf had ever been able to explain their purpose. Amy reached out, slowly, and asked if she could look closer. Alara nodded, and the human woman studied the glowing patterns on her arm. Amy said they looked like circuitry or maybe genetic code. Ilara did not understand these references, but before she could ask more questions, her sensitive hearing picked up a new sound. Something big was coming through the forest, and it was moving fast. Amy's squad heard it too, and they raised their weapons. Then the trees exploded apart, and a massive Crithian warrior emerged. This creature was 3 times the size of the normal soldiers, and it was covered in thick armor plates that looked like they could stop anything. It roared, and the sound made the ground shake. Amy's squad opened fire, but their bullets bounced off the heavy armor. The creature charged, and Amy shouted for her people to scatter. Ilara raised her weapon and fired concentrated bolts of energy, but even these only scorched the armor without penetrating. Shadowfire launched himself at the creature, and the 2 massive beings collided with tremendous force. They rolled across the ground, tearing up trees and earth. The dragon bit and clawed, but the Crithian warrior was strong, and it wrapped tentacle-like appendages around Shadowfire's neck. Amy was shouting into her radio, calling for support, but Ilara knew there was no time. She closed her eyes and reached deep inside herself to where the markings connected to something ancient and unknown. Power flooded through her, and her entire body began to glow. She had never done this before because she had always been afraid of what it might mean, but her friend was dying and there was no choice. Ilara released the power, and blue lightning erupted from her hands. The energy struck the Crithian warrior, and it screamed as the lightning burned through its armor like it was paper. Shadowfire broke free and finished the creature with a blast of his cold fire. The massive Crithian collapsed and did not move again. Ilara fell to her knees and her markings dimmed. Amy rushed to her side and caught her before she could fall further. The human woman asked if she was all right. Ilara said she did not know what had just happened. Amy helped her stand and said that whatever it was, it had saved all their lives. One of Amy's squad members called out that more Crithian forces were approaching, and they needed to move. Amy made a decision quickly, and she told Ilara that they should head back to the city together. It would be safer with the walls and defenses. Ilara agreed, and she climbed onto Shadowfire's back. Amy hesitated, and then asked if there was room for her squad. Shadowfire rumbled and lowered himself closer to the ground. The humans climbed onto the dragon's back, and they held on tight as Shadowfire launched into the air. Flying over the forest, Ilara could see the full scope of the Crithian invasion. There were thousands of creatures moving through the trees, all heading toward the elven cities. But she could also see human dropships landing and deploying more soldiers to form defensive lines. The humans were not just protecting from space, and they were sending their people down to fight on the ground alongside the elves. Amy sat behind Ilara, and she spoke over the wind. She said that her commander wanted to meet with the elven leaders. There were things they needed to discuss about why humanity was really here. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. She asked what Amy meant. Amy said that the human fleet had not come to Sylvathir by accident. They had been searching for something, and they had been searching for someone. Ilara asked who they were looking for. Amy looked directly at her and said they were looking for the one marked by the precursors. They were looking for Ilara. The dragon flew on through the smoke and fire, carrying humans and elf toward a city under siege, and Ilara felt her world shifting beneath her as she realized that her life had been built on secrets she did not understand. Behind them, the forest burned and the Crithian swarm pressed forward. But ahead, human and elven forces were gathering together for the first time. 2 species who should never have met were now standing side by side against the darkness. And somewhere in orbit, a coded transmission was being received by the Confederacy of Stars, a transmission that would change everything. The council chamber had survived the bombardment, but barely, and cracks ran through the ancient crystal walls, like spider webs. Ilara stood before the gathered elven elders, and beside her stood Commander Katie Morrison, who had come down from the fleet to meet with the leadership. Katie was tall for a human, and her uniform was pristine despite the chaos of the battle. She carried herself with the bearing of someone used to command, and when she spoke, every person in the room listened. The elders wanted to know why humanity had intervened when no one else had answered the distress call. Katie did not soften the truth, and she told them that the Confederacy had received the signal hours before humanity did. The elven elders looked shocked, and one demanded to know how Katie could know this. Katie pulled out a data device and projected information into the air above the council table. The hologram showed communications between Confederacy members, and the timestamps proved that they had debated what to do about Sylvathir for 6 hours before voting to abandon the planet. The cost of intervention was deemed too high, and the risk to Confederacy ships too great. They had chosen to let the elves die. The elders were silent, with shock and betrayal written across their faces. One elder asked why humanity had come then, if even their supposed allies had turned away. Katie looked directly at Alara when she answered. She said that humanity had discovered something on Mars buried deep beneath the surface. It was a data cache left by a species that had existed long before any current galactic civilization. The cache contained star maps and warnings about threats like the Crythian swarm, but it also contained specific information about certain individuals scattered across the galaxy. Individuals who had been created for a purpose. Katie said that Alara was one of those individuals. The cache called her the Marked One, and it said she was the key to defeating an enemy far worse than the Crythians. Alara felt every eye in the room turn to her, and her markings began to pulse with that now familiar blue light. She had suspected for centuries that she was different, but she had never known why. One of the elders demanded to know what Katie meant by created. Katie said that according to the precursor data, Alara was not fully elven. She was a hybrid created by combining elven genetics with something else. Something the precursors called the Living Weapon Protocol. The words hit Alara like a physical blow. She looked down at her hands and saw the markings glowing brighter. Shadowfire, who had been lying quietly in the corner of the chamber, suddenly raised his head and looked at Alara with what might have been sorrow in his ancient eyes. Alara felt her voice shake as she asked Katie what she was, if she was not truly elven. Katie softened her tone and she said that Alara was exactly who she had always been. The genetic modifications did not change her heart or her choices. They only gave her capabilities that would be needed when the time came. One elder accused Katie of lying and said this was human manipulation. But Shadowfire stood and the dragon spoke for the first time in the presence of others. His voice was deep and it resonated in the minds of everyone present. The dragon said he had always known what Alara was. His kind had been created by the precursors as well, and they were meant to bond with the Marked Ones, to serve as guardians and amplifiers. Shadowfire said he had waited 3,000 years for Alara to be born. He had watched over her since she was young, and he had never told her the truth because she needed to grow into her own person first. But now, the time for secrets was over. Alara felt tears on her cheeks, and she did not know if they were from anger or sadness. Her entire life had been built on lies. Katie stepped forward, and she placed a hand on Alara's shoulder. The human commander said she understood how Alara must feel, but they did not have the luxury of time to process this revelation. Katie brought up another hologram, and this one showed data that made everyone in the room go silent. The Crythian swarm was not the real threat. They were refugees. Thousands of years ago, something had driven the Crythians from their home galaxy. The precursor data called it the Void Chorus, and it was described as a consciousness that consumed entire civilizations and turned them into extensions of itself. The precursors had fought the Void Chorus, and they had managed to seal it away using living weapons like Alara as anchors for the seal. But the seals were failing, and the Void Chorus was breaking free. The Crythians had been desperately trying to reinforce the seals by harvesting psychic energy from worlds like Sylvathir. They were not evil, and they were terrified. An elder asked why the Crythians had not simply explained this. Katie said that the Void Chorus had infiltrated the Confederacy long ago. Any species that tried to warn others about the truth was silenced. The Crythians had no choice but to act in secret even if it made them seem like monsters. Alara tried to absorb all of this information and her mind was spinning. She asked what would happen if the seals failed completely. Katie showed them images from the galactic rim where 17 star systems had already gone dark. Entire civilizations had vanished, and the only thing left behind was empty space that seemed to absorb light itself. The Void Chorus was already free and it was coming. One elder asked what humanity expected the elves to do with this information. Katie said that Commander Morrison had a plan, but it would require cooperation between humanity and the elves and the Crythians. The elder laughed bitterly and said the elves would never ally with the creatures that had killed thousands of their people. Katie said she understood, but the alternative was extinction for everyone. At that moment, alarms began blaring throughout the city. New ships were arriving in the system, and scanners identified them as Confederacy vessels. The elves felt a moment of hope, thinking their allies had finally come. But Katie checked her data feed, and her expression grew dark. She said the Confederacy ships were not there to help. They were there to stop humanity from interfering. One of Katie's officers burst into the chamber and reported that Confederacy Ships were demanding the human fleet withdraw immediately. They claimed that humanity had no right to intervene in galactic affairs. Katie asked for a channel to her fleet, and she broadcast a message that everyone in the council chamber could hear. She spoke to Ambassador Lisa Chen, who was aboard the flagship. Katie asked for status, and Lisa replied that the Confederacy was threatening military action if humanity did not leave. Lisa asked what their orders were. Katie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that humanity had not come all this way to abandon people in need. She ordered the fleet to hold position and defend Sylvathir, regardless of Confederacy threats. Lisa acknowledged the order and said that humanity would stand firm. The Confederacy response came quickly, and their lead ship fired a warning shot across the bow of the human flagship. Katie watched the tactical display, and Alara saw her jaw tighten. One of the Elven elders said that humanity should leave before this turned into a war. Katie turned to face the elder, and her eyes were hard. She said that humanity had learned long ago that standing up for what was right often meant standing alone. If the Confederacy wanted to fire on human ships for protecting innocent lives, then that would be on the Confederacy conscience, not on humanity's. The elder said that this was not humanity's fight. Katie replied that the moment they heard the distress call, it became their fight. She said that humanity refused to live in a galaxy where the powerful abandoned the weak. The council chamber erupted in argument, with some elders saying they should accept Confederacy authority and others saying they owed humanity a debt. Ilara felt Shadowfire press against her leg, and she looked down at her dragon. Through their bond, she could feel his thoughts. He was telling her that the time had come to choose who she was. Not what she had been created to be, but who she chose to be. Ilara stepped forward, and her voice cut through the arguing. She said that she had been lied to her entire life about what she was. But Katie and the humans had come to Sylvathir knowing the truth, and they had come anyway. They had not tried to use her or manipulate her, and they had simply fought to protect her people. She said that she trusted the humans more than she trusted the Confederacy, who had voted to let her world burn. She said that she would work with Katie to stop the Void Chorus. Shadowfire roared his agreement, and the sound shook the walls. Several of the elders protested, but others nodded in acceptance. Katie smiled, and it was the first time Alara had seen the commander show genuine emotion. Katie said they would need to move quickly. She wanted to arrange a meeting between human and Crithian representatives. If they could broker peace between the elves and Crithians, they might have a chance. But even as she spoke, the tactical displays showed more Confederacy ships arriving. And worse, the Crithian swarm was mobilizing again. The largest bioships Alara had ever seen were emerging from the outer system. These vessels were covered in the same glowing markings that covered Alara's skin. Katie looked at the display and then at Alara. She said that the Crithians were not attacking. They were coming to Alara. The bioships wanted to reach the marked one. Shadowfire suddenly went rigid, and his eyes became unfocused. The dragon was receiving information through channels Alara could not access. When Shadowfire returned to himself, he looked at Alara with fear in his ancient eyes. He said that Alara transformation was beginning, whether she was ready or not. The presence of humanity had activated something in her genetic code. She was starting to change into what the precursors had designed her to be. Alara looked down and saw that her markings were spreading. They were growing across her skin in new patterns, and they pulsed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Katie asked what they should do. Alara said she did not know. She was supposed to become a seal to lock away the Void Chorus forever, but that would mean giving up everything she was. Katie said there had to be another way. Humanity did not believe in sacrificing individuals for the greater good. There was always another option. Alara wanted to believe her, but the pain was growing as her body began to change. Outside, the Crithian bioships drew closer, and the Confederacy fleet moved to intercept. And somewhere beyond the edge of the galaxy, the Void Chorus felt the activation of one of its ancient prisons. It began to move toward Sylvathir with hunger that had been building for millennia. The final war was beginning. The human science vessel arrived in orbit 12 hours after the Crithian bioships had taken up position around Sylvathir. Captain Nina Walsh led a team of xenoarchaeologists who had spent months decoding the precursor data from Mars. She came to the surface in a small shuttle and met with Katie and Alara in a secured chamber beneath the city. Nina was older than most of the human soldiers Alara had seen, and her hair was gray at the temples. She carried data tablets covered in symbols that looked similar to Alara's markings. Nina spread the information across the table and began to explain what they had discovered. The precursors had not been a single species, but rather a coalition of races that had united against a common enemy. That enemy was the Void Chorus. Nina showed images of what the precursors had recorded before they fell. The Void Chorus was not alive in any traditional sense, and it was a form of consciousness that existed in the spaces between realities. It fed on thoughts and emotions, and when it consumed a species, it absorbed their minds into its collective. Those absorbed beings did not die, and instead they became parts of the Void Chorus, forever aware, but unable to resist. It was a fate worse than death. The precursors had fought for 10,000 years before they realized they could not destroy the Void Chorus. So instead they built prisons. They created biological locks using genetic engineering to produce beings whose very existence would reinforce the barriers between dimensions. Alara was one of those locks, and there were others scattered across the galaxy. But most had failed over the millennia, and Alara was one of the last. Nina explained that when Alara fully transformed, she would become a living seal. Her consciousness would spread across dimensional barriers, and she would spend eternity holding back the Void Chorus alone. Katie slammed her hand on the table and said that was unacceptable. There had to be another way. Nina said that was why she had come. The human scientists had been working on alternative solutions. She believed that instead of sealing the Void Chorus away, they could potentially kill it. Katie asked how that was possible if the precursors with all their technology had failed. Nina said that the precursors had fought defensively. They had tried to protect what they had rather than taking the fight to the enemy. Humanity specialized in offense. Nina proposed a plan that made everyone in the room go silent. They would gather the combined forces of humanity and the elves and the Crithians. Then they would punch through the dimensional barrier and attack the Void Chorus in its own realm. It was insane, but Katie was listening. Alara asked what would happen to the dimensional barriers if they were breached deliberately. Nina admitted that it could make things worse. The Void Chorus might flood into normal space. But Nina argued they were out of options. The seals were failing anyway, and within months the Void Chorus would break through regardless. At least this way they could fight on their own terms. Shadowfire, who had been silent, suddenly spoke in their minds. The dragon said that Nina's plan would require a guide, someone who could navigate the twisted dimensions of the Void Chorus realm, someone who was connected to both the physical world and the dimensional barriers. Shadowfire said he could do this, but only if bonded with Alara in her transformed state. Alara looked at her dragon and asked if that meant they would both be trapped. Shadowfire said yes, and his mental voice was calm. But he had lived for thousands of years already, and if his last act was to help save the galaxy, then that was a worthy end. Alara felt tears again, but before she could respond, alarms blared throughout the facility. Katie checked her communications, and her face went pale. She said that Confederacy ships were firing on the Crithian bioships. The fragile standoff in orbit had just collapsed into open warfare. Nina cursed and said they were out of time. They needed to make contact with the Crithians immediately. Katie said that Major Beth Harper was already attempting to establish communications. She had taken a small ship with a white flag into the space between the human fleet and the Crithian bioships. It was incredibly dangerous, but Beth had volunteered. Alara asked why a human would risk her life to talk to creatures that had killed her people. Katie said that Beth believed in giving everyone a chance at peace, even enemies. The communications feed connected, and they could hear Beth's voice as she broadcast to the Crithian ships. Beth explained that humanity understood the truth now. They knew the Crithians were fleeing the Void Chorus and trying to reinforce the seals. Beth said that humanity wanted to propose an alliance. Together they could fight the real enemy. For long moments there was only silence. Then a reply came, and the translation was rough but understandable. The Crithian hive speaker agreed to meet. Katie immediately ordered a ceasefire and sent word to the Confederacy ships to stand down. The Confederacy refused, and they continued firing. Katie made a decision. She ordered the human fleet to position themselves between the Confederacy ships and the Crithian bioships. The humans would shield the Crithians with their own vessels. It was a declaration that humanity was choosing sides. The Confederacy commander sent a furious message demanding that Katie withdraw. Katie replied that the Confederacy had lost the moral authority to give commands when they abandoned Sylvathir. If the Confederacy wanted to reach the Crithians, they would have to go through humanity first. The Confederacy ships hesitated. They had not expected the humans to be so defiant. The meeting was arranged on neutral ground aboard a massive human carrier. Alara attended along with Katie and Nina and several elven elders who had chosen to support the alliance. The Crithian hive speaker arrived in a shuttle that looked like a living organism. When it emerged, Alara saw that the hive speaker was immense, and covered in the same kind of armor as the Crithian soldiers but far more elaborate. The creature spoke through a translation device, and its voice was like wind through hollow tubes. It said that the Crithians had been running for 5,000 years. Their home galaxy had fallen to the Void Chorus, and they had fled with whatever survivors they could save. They had discovered that consuming psychic energy from living worlds could temporarily strengthen the dimensional seals. It was a horrible choice, but it was the only way they knew to buy time. The Hive speaker said they were sorry for the elven lives lost, but they were trying to save everyone from a fate far worse. One of the elven elders asked why the Crithians had not simply explained this. The Hive speaker said they tried centuries ago. The species they contacted were absorbed into the Confederacy and then silenced. The Void Chorus had infiltrated the highest levels of galactic government. Any mention of the truth was suppressed. Nina asked if the Hive speaker knew how deep the infiltration went. The Hive speaker said that at least 30% of the Confederacy Council was compromised. These individuals were not fully absorbed, and they retained their personalities. But they had been touched by the Void Chorus, and it could influence their decisions. The goal was to keep the galaxy divided and weak. Katie said that explained why the Confederacy had voted to abandon Sylvathir. The Void Chorus did not want the younger races uniting. The Hive speaker agreed. Nina presented her plan to attack the Void Chorus directly. The Hive speaker was silent for a long time. Then it said that such a plan had never been attempted because it was considered suicide. But the Hive speaker also said that the Crithians were tired of running. If humanity was willing to lead an attack, then the Crithians would follow. The alliance was formed with a simple agreement between three desperate species. Alara felt the weight of what was coming. She asked the Hive speaker what would happen to her if she completed the transformation. The Hive speaker said that Alara would become something beyond mortal understanding. She would exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Her consciousness would stretch across reality. It would be lonely beyond measure. Shadowfire pressed against Alara's leg and reminded her that she would not be alone. He would be there. Katie said they still had time to find another solution. Nina said her scientists were working on it, but they needed weeks, and they did not have weeks. The dimensional barriers were degrading faster than predicted. Outside the chamber, the combined fleet began organizing. Human warships took position alongside Crithian bioships and elven vessels. It was the first time these species had worked together. Soldiers who had been killing each other days ago were now coordinating tactics. On Sylvathir, human marines trained alongside elven warriors. They learned each other's weapons and fighting styles. The humans taught the elves about suppressing fire and room clearing. The elves taught the humans about energy manipulation and psychic combat. Amy Brooks found herself leading a mixed unit of humans and elves. She reported to Katie that despite the language barriers and cultural differences, the soldiers were bonding quickly. Shared danger had a way of building trust. Shadowfire began spending time with human pilots. He taught them how to think in 3 dimensions during combat. The pilots learned to maneuver their ships the way a dragon flew. Meanwhile, Alara spent her time with Nina trying to understand what she was. The markings on her skin were spreading and she could feel her perceptions changing. She was starting to sense things that existed beyond normal reality. She could feel the dimensional barriers weakening, and she could feel something massive moving toward them from the dark between stars. The Void Chorus knew she was here. It was coming to claim her. Nina ran test after test and she discovered something important. Alara's transformation could be controlled if she had an anchor to physical reality. Shadowfire was one anchor, but Nina believed that if Alara maintained strong emotional connections to others, she might retain her sense of self even after transformation. Katie suggested that Alara bond with the entire fleet. Not in the mystical way she was bonded with Shadowfire, but through simple friendship and trust. Alara began meeting with soldiers from all 3 species. She learned their names and their stories. She found that humans told jokes even in the face of death. The Crithians sang mourning songs for their lost galaxy. The elves recited poetry about the stars. Each connection strengthened something inside her. The markings stopped spreading as fast. Nina said it was working. Alara was building a network of consciousness that could sustain her, but they were running out of time. Sensors detected a massive distortion at the edge of the system. The dimensional barrier was tearing. The Void Chorus was coming through, and it was bringing an army of absorbed species with it. Ships that had been consumed millennia ago now served as vessels for the Void Chorus. Entire civilizations that had fallen were now weapons. Katie gave the order. The combined fleet would make their stand here. And if they survived, they would follow through the breach and take the fight to the enemy. Alara looked at Shadowfire and her new friends, and she made a choice. She would transform, and she would become the weapon she was designed to be. But she would do it her way. She would not seal the Void Chorus away. She would burn it out of existence. The final battle was about to begin. The dimensional rift tore open across the sky above Sylvathir, and it looked like someone had cut a wound in reality itself. Through the breach came ships that defied comprehension. They were vessels from 100 extinct civilizations, all consumed by the Void Chorus and turned into weapons. Some were biological like the Crithian bioships but twisted and wrong. Others were mechanical but they moved with organic fluidity. All of them pulsed with the same dark energy that seemed to absorb light. Katie stood on the bridge of the human flagship and she watched the enemy fleet emerge. Her tactical officer reported over 300 hostile vessels and more were coming through every minute. The Confederacy battle fleet that had been threatening humanity suddenly found itself facing the real enemy. Ambassador Claire Rodriguez had been negotiating with the Confederacy admiral when the breach opened. Now she watched as Confederacy ships opened fire on the Void Chorus vessels. But something was wrong. Half the Confederacy ships were firing on the other half. Claire realized with horror that the infiltration was worse than they thought. Some Confederacy crews had been fully absorbed, and they were turning on their own people. The Confederacy fleet collapsed into chaos as ships fired on each other. Katie made a decision and ordered the human fleet to protect the uncompromised Confederacy vessels. She sent a broadcast to all ships saying that anyone fighting the Void Chorus was an ally. The human warships moved to shield the Confederacy vessels that were still free. At the same time, Crithian bioships and Elven cruisers formed a defensive perimeter around Sylvathir. The combined fleet fought together against the Void Chorus attack. Alara stood on the surface and watched the battle rage overhead. Her transformation was accelerating, and she could feel her consciousness expanding. She was starting to exist in multiple places at once. Part of her was still on Sylvathir, but part of her was touching the dimensional barriers. She could feel the Void Chorus presence like a massive weight pressing against reality. It was aware of her, and it was hungry. Shadowfire stood beside her, and the dragon was calm. He told her through their bond that when the time came they would merge. Their combined essence would become something new. A weapon that could burn across dimensions. Nina ran up to them carrying a device that looked like a harness covered in glowing circuits. She said this was the anchor. It would keep Alara connected to physical reality even after she transformed. The device was keyed to the quantum signatures of everyone Alara had bonded with. As long as those people lived, Alara would have a path back. Alara put on the harness and felt it integrate with her markings. The sensation was strange but not painful. Katie's voice came over the communication system. She said the Void Chorus main force was concentrating at the breach. They were preparing to push through in overwhelming numbers. Nina said this was the moment. If Alara was going to transform, it had to be now. Alara looked at Shadowfire and asked if he was ready. The dragon said he had been ready for 3,000 years. Alara closed her eyes and stopped fighting the transformation. She let the genetic programming activate fully. Power flooded through her body, and her markings blazed with light so bright that people across the city had to look away. Her form began to change and she was growing larger. Shadowfire moved to her side and he began to glow as well. The dragon and the elf merged together, and their bodies flowed into each other like water mixing. What emerged was something that had never existed before. It was neither dragon nor elf, nor precursor weapon. It was all of these, and more. The new being stood 20 feet tall, with scales of starlight and eyes that burned with blue fire. It had wings that seemed to be made of folded space. When it spoke, the voice resonated across multiple dimensions. Alara consciousness was still there but expanded. She could see across vast distances, and she could feel every life in the fleet. Katie looked up at the transformed Alara and asked if she could still hear them. Alara's response came directly into Katie's mind. She said she could hear everything. She could hear the thoughts of every soldier in the fleet. She could feel their fear and their courage. Katie asked what Alara needed them to do. Alara said they needed to break through the Void Chorus forces and reach the dimensional breach. Once there, Alara could pull the entire fleet through into the Void Chorus home dimension. They would take the fight to the enemy heart. It was a one-way trip. Anyone who went through would never return to normal space. Katie did not hesitate. She broadcast to the entire fleet asking for volunteers. Every single ship responded. The humans said they were ready. The Crithians said they had been running for too long, and it was time to fight. The elves said they would not let Alara fight alone. Even the Free Confederacy ships volunteered. Their crews said they wanted to make up for their government's failure. Katie felt pride swell in her chest. She gave the order to advance. The combined fleet surged forward, and Alara flew at their head like a living comet. The Void Chorus vessels moved to intercept, but Alara had become something they could not fully comprehend. She existed in multiple dimensions, and she struck at them from angles that should not exist. Her fire burned cold and hot simultaneously. It froze and incinerated at the same time. Void Chorus ships shattered under her assault. The fleet followed in her wake, and they poured everything they had into the enemy. Human railguns fired at maximum rate. Crithian bioweapons dissolved enemy hulls. Elven energy beams carved through formations. The uncompromised Confederacy ships added their firepower. Together they were unstoppable. But the Void Chorus was learning. The absorbed consciousnesses within it began to coordinate better. They started predicting Alara's movements. A massive Void Chorus dreadnought emerged from the breach. This ship was the size of a moon, and it radiated malevolence. Alara could feel the minds trapped within it, millions of beings all screaming silently. The dreadnought fired a weapon that tore at the fabric of space itself. Several human ships were caught in the blast, and they simply ceased to exist. Katie ordered all ships to concentrate fire on the dreadnought. The entire fleet turned their weapons on the massive vessel. Nuclear missiles detonated against its hull. Kinetic rounds punched deep into its structure. But it was too large and too powerful. It would take hours to destroy it, and they did not have hours. Alara made a decision. She flew directly at the dreadnought, and she poured all her power into a single point. Her fire burned brighter than a star. She struck the dreadnought core, and the massive ship began to break apart. But the effort cost Alara dearly. She felt her connection to physical reality weakening. Nina's voice came through the communication system, warning that Alara's quantum signature was destabilizing. Katie immediately ordered everyone in the fleet to focus their thoughts on Alara. Thousands of soldiers and crew members began to think about the being who was fighting to save them. They remembered meeting her and training with her. They sent their gratitude and their hope. The anchor device on Alara's form blazed to life, and it pulled her back from the edge. Her connection to reality stabilized. She realized that Katie's plan was working. As long as she maintained these connections, she could survive the transformation. The fleet reached the dimensional breach, and Alara could see into the realm beyond. It was a place of nightmare geometry where up and down had no meaning. Colors existed that should not be possible. And at the center of it all was the Void Chorus itself. It was massive beyond comprehension. A consciousness made of stolen minds, stretching across dimensions. Alara spoke to Katie one last time before they crossed over. She said that once they entered, there would be no return. The breach would close behind them. Katie said she understood. Then she said something that Alara would remember forever. Katie said that humanity had learned long ago that some things were worth dying for. Protecting the innocent was one of those things. Standing against evil was another. If this was where their journey ended, then at least it ended with purpose. The fleet crossed the dimensional barrier, and reality twisted around them. They emerged into the Void Chorus realm, and immediately the battle began. But here the rules of physics did not apply. Ships could move in directions that should not exist. Weapons fired across impossible angles. Alara adapted quickly, and she taught the fleet how to fight in this strange space. She shared her expanded perceptions through the quantum link. Human pilots began to understand how to navigate. They learned to think in more than 3 dimensions. The Crithians found that their bioships could reshape themselves to match the geometry. The elves discovered that their psychic abilities were amplified here. The Confederacy ships struggled at first, but they learned. Together, the fleet carved a path through the Void Chorus forces. They fought their way toward the center where the main consciousness resided. It took weeks in subjective time, though time had no real meaning in this place. They lost ships along the way. Good people died fighting impossible enemies. But they kept pushing forward. Amy Brooks led ground forces that boarded absorbed vessels and freed the crews that could still be saved. Not everyone could be rescued, and some minds had been too thoroughly integrated, but they saved who they could. Nina worked constantly to maintain the quantum anchors that kept everyone connected to each other. As long as they remembered who they were, the Void Chorus could not absorb them. Finally, they reached the heart. The core of the Void Chorus was a massive sphere of twisted consciousness. It spoke to them in the voices of everyone it had ever consumed. It tried to tempt them with promises of immortality. It tried to frighten them with visions of their worst fears. But the fleet held firm. Katie gave the final order. Every ship that could still fight moved into position around the core. Alara gathered all her power, and she prepared to strike. But she realized that destroying the Void Chorus would leave a hole in the dimensional structure. They needed to replace it with something else. She asked Katie what humanity believed should fill the void. Katie thought for a moment and then she smiled. She said hope. They would leave behind hope. Alara understood, and she channeled her power not to destroy but to transform. She would become the new guardian of this dimensional space. Not a seal, holding back evil, but a light keeping the darkness away. Shadowfire's consciousness merged more fully with hers. Together they would stand watch forever. The fleet understood what this meant. They would stay here with Alara. They would become eternal sentinels guarding the boundary between dimensions. It was not the victory they had imagined, but it was enough. Katie ordered the final assault. Every ship fired everything they had. Alara released her transformation in a wave of pure creative energy. The Void Chorus core shattered. The absorbed minds were finally freed and allowed to find peace. In the explosion of released consciousness, Alara and Shadowfire expanded to fill the void. They became a living threshold between dimensions. The fleet took up positions around them, and they prepared for eternal duty. Back in normal space, the dimensional breach sealed. The surviving forces celebrated their victory. The Confederacy government fell when the infiltration was exposed. New leaders rose who valued cooperation over isolation. Sylvathir began to heal. On the surface, Amy Brooks stood before a monument of black crystal and starlight. Carved into it were the names of every being who had crossed the dimensional barrier. The monument was a reminder of the price of freedom. In the quantum realm, Katie stood beside Alara, and they looked out at the fleet arrayed around them. Katie asked if Alara regretted her choice. Alara said no. She had found purpose, and she had found family. The humans had not arrived first by accident. They had arrived first because they were willing, and that made all the difference. Above them, the eternal fleet held the line between light and dark. They would stand watch forever, and the galaxy would remember their sacrifice.